He is also going to be our gospel preacher for our meeting in the fall, and so we're glad to have him back again, and we look forward to his lesson today. And we hope and pray that everyone came ready with their minds open. We're going to be talking about Paul and his need to be constructed or reconstructed. We'll talk about that tonight.
All right, y'all hear me okay? If I'm too loud, I can move this down or up or wherever it needs to be. I don't have a lot of problems being heard even without a microphone usually, so I have to be very careful. But I am thankful for the opportunity to be here tonight, the invitation that come available, and then, of course, for sure looking forward to being back in the fall. That's kind of how this all started, was that invitation, and now here we are today, getting to drive over from Cave City on a Wednesday evening and getting to see some folks that I know from other places, some folks that I've known for quite some time, yes, some folks that I'm kin to, and just glad to be here tonight. This is a class. I'm not going to stand up here and lecture for 45 minutes. So remember when he said, I hope you're ready, I hope you're ready, because it's going to be a group effort. We're not going to just me try to teach you. We're going to learn together. I can tell you it's already been worth the trip. My two sons and one of the girlfriends came. And they've already learned some stuff about some of the songs and things, because the boys have to lead some singing in VBSs and things. So I don't like the way that sounds. Let's get that down there maybe. We can hear a little bit different. It sounded awful loud to me. So anyway, they've learned some things about leading singing at VBS, stuff we don't do. Remember that under construction thing? That's what the whole thing we're talking about this week has been. We've already had some building go on. We're going to do that. My topic is Paul. We tend to, as people, do what? We want to put a qualifier on a name, right? If I said to you the name Thomas, what do you think of? Every time, right? Doubting Thomas. You know, that's just what he's known as. Not the only thing that he did, but it's what he's known as, right? If I mentioned the Bereans, what do we say? Noble Bereans, right? We want to have that qualifier. And actually, if you read that a little bit closer over there in the book of Acts, it says that they were actually more noble than those at Thessalonica. So actually, we would need to be the noble Thessalonians and the more noble Bereans. But we like to say the noble Bereans. But we like to put those qualifiers. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the names, not only that we put with Paul, but that maybe we don't put with Paul, that can help us to learn something from him. All right? What's the easy one when talking about Paul? Apostle. That's the easy one, right? We could literally spend our time period, this class period, looking at all that it took just for him to be an apostle. You realize that was no easy feat, right? You know, there are some very clear, very specific requirements for someone to be an apostle. And for for all of his early life, Paul didn't meet those, right? Now, we're not going to do it. But like I said, we've got 40-ish minutes, whatever, together. We're not going to get all we need from the Bible in this period of time. I am going to give you some things maybe to cause you to want to spend some time in the Bible outside of here. I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge. It's kind of a neat little challenge. I actually did it last night. It does not take very long. When you get home sometime and just reading, not in your study time, just when you sit down with the Bible and open it, go through in all the letters that Paul wrote. Start in the book of Romans. Just begin to read the first 2, 3, 4, 5 verses of each one of those letters. And you will see in the majority of those, it will refer to Paul, an apostle of, or called to be an apostle, or something like that. And you'll see how in those introductions that the Holy Spirit gave him to call himself an apostle. And he was, and we know that. But it also gives us a lot of the information about why and how and the reason he was called to be an apostle. But that's the easy one. Like I told you, we're not going to just do the easy ones. We're going to do some of the hard ones. What's another term we might use for Paul? Pharisee of Pharisees. Pharisee of Pharisees. Yeah. You know, like I tell people, he was as Jew as a Jew could get, wasn't he? Right? Jew as a Jew could get. As a matter of fact, when he was rehearsing a lot of this stuff in front of people, basically, I've sat at the feet of the best teachers. I've been there, I've seen it, I've done it. So where would the problem be in thinking about that? Let's roll around now to the topic that we're talking about. I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. Had the best teaching. How does that affect his being a servant under construction? Let me ask you this. Our job as Christians is to go out and to preach and teach the gospel, right? Would Paul, when he was Saul, would he have been one we would have went to? I like that answer. No. Because here's what we do, right? It's much like this. If you're going out to teach and preach the gospel, you usually don't go find a building that wears a denominational name, and you go in and you say, all right, who preaches here? And that's the guy you go at first, right? That's not the way we usually do things. And so Paul, being a Pharisee of Pharisees, would not have been the easiest one. The good thing is, who went to teach him? Kind of got to be careful about how you answer that question, right? Who was the first to teach him? Jesus did, right? Y'all remember, everybody in the world wants to talk so much about the road to Damascus. That was his first teaching. Go into the city. It'll be told what you need to do. So yeah, Pharisee of Pharisees. That's a good one. That's one I actually didn't have written down, didn't think of. Yeah. What else? Paul. Huh? Persecutor. Okay. That's a good one because we're going to look a little deeper on that in just a minute too. Persecutor. Book of Acts. Right? Go over there. Let's actually see some of these scriptures we're talking about. So he was, and that's one of the things especially we have to realize, and this is actually a good transition. That was one of the things, by the way, Terry Joe, that the boys noticed was your transition from song to song. They like that, so they've marked a few of those notes down. So notice with Acts chapter 8, you've read this. You know the story. And it says, and Saul was consenting unto his death in the very first verse of Acts chapter 8. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. They were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Notice verse 3. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. He was a persecutor, wasn't he? As a matter of fact, that's how he got on that road to Damascus. If you remember, it happens just a chapter later, there in Acts chapter 9. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, desired of him letters to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Okay. Along that line, we probably need to think about it the other way. He was persecutor, but actually if you're studying Paul, he was persecuted. Well, and see, that's what oftentimes, I did the same thing you did, Mark. Same thing. I thought persecutor. Then as I was doing some study, I thought, but he was also persecuted. I found it interesting, and I hope you caught it as we were reading that. It said there, as we were going through in Acts chapter 8, how he was wanting to go into all the houses, and didn't matter men or women or what, he committed them to prison. What's some of the best work we've ever had recorded for us by Paul? He was in prison, wasn't he? He was in prison. You know, it's kind of one of those deals that something like that happens today. What would people say? Well, karma, you know, or all of those types of things. But we realize that he was, at one time, the persecutor, and then he became the persecuted. That's not the kind of construction, that's not the kind of, I guess you would say, moving we would want to have, right? We wouldn't want to have to be in his situation. Let's look at some more verses in that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians. I like this idea of going from persecutor to persecuted. 2 Corinthians, 11th chapter, when you get there. These are not going to be verses that are unfamiliar to you. You know these things. It's Wednesday night of VBS. I'm not dealing with people that don't know their Bible. I understand that. But I still want us to be able to turn there and see these things. 2 Corinthians 11th chapter, notice what it says when you start there in verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Goes on and says, thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. Now think about that. Let's slip on the sandals of Paul. Understand how far he has come from being the persecutor to now the persecuted. Okay? Put yourself in there. Read down through those things that he mentioned. And at what point would you have stopped? Which beating would you say, that's enough? Right? How many times? And here's the thing. Not all of those did you catch were persecutions necessarily. Some of them were just, guess what? In his travel, some things happened. We would call them more of maybe like a, necessarily a temptation, but more of a trial, right? Let's just say, very minor compared to what we're talking about. Let's say that we'd have gotten in the car, we'd have started over here, got about halfway, and had a flat tire. Right? No, wait. More likely than that. Let's say we got in the car, started over here, and hit a deer. Okay? Because we have a lot of deer between here and there. All right? Let's say that happened. Well, make a phone call. Look, tore the car up. We're going to try to get another vehicle and get over there, still be there in time. Get there, and you start out, and you have a flat. And all of a sudden, it's just like there's no way we're going to make it. Rolls around this fall, start to head over here. Car's fixed, but hit another deer. Don't laugh, it happens up in our part of the country. At what point would it be like, it's just not meant for me to go to Greensboro Road to teach? And that's minor stuff. We're talking about, notice, I hope you caught there as we were reading, it said in prisons more frequent. I don't know what more frequent than he's talking about there, but it was often. Persecuted. He definitely was that. You do realize that that's, well, let's get this out of the way. Remember over there when he wrote the book of Philippians? There's a verse there in Philippians that you'll hear in the 4th chapter. You'll see it on T-shirts and stuff. You can probably quote it. You know what it is? Think about it. I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me, right? You know, I mean, that's, you hear it. You see it. That's a beautiful verse. And as much as I want to, I can't go out here and jump off this building and fly, even if I want to. But notice the context of what he's saying there. Go back before this. When he said in verse 12, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. If somebody in the United States of America penned those words, would they mean the same thing? No. We've got it pretty good, especially those of us that get the blessing of living here in the buckle of the Bible Belt, so to speak. Paul the persecutor as Saul, and now Paul the persecuted could write these words, and they have a meaning that is stronger than most. The influence is bigger than it would have been if many would have written it. He'd lived both sides of it. He had been the persecutor. He was now the persecuted. There were trials, there were temptations, and I fully believe that he counted it all joy when he fell into all of these temptations, as James tells us. Persecuted. I've actually got in 3 weeks, I'll be speaking at a summer series on a Wednesday night there in Batesville. And my topic is, would persecution help the church? Well, we could talk a lot about that, couldn't we? Would persecution help the church? I'll give a very preacherly answer. The answer is yes and no. But I can tell you this, that Paul, as Saul being the persecutor, as was mentioned, and Paul being the persecuted, it helps us today. Because I can tell you, as I read down through that list of things that we read over there in 2 Corinthians, I realized that I need work as a servant. You hear me closely there, I hope. I need work as a servant. Yes, I have the blessing of being able to stand in a pulpit each Lord's day. I get many opportunities to go and visit and speak and those types of things, but I need work as a servant if that is the measuring stick that we've got to use. It's one of the things you use in construction, isn't it? Man, you want everything the right length, you want it to be square, you want it to be plumb, you want it to be... If that's the measuring stick that's got to be used, this servant needs a lot of work. I'm thankful for the topic that was chosen. I don't know how it was chosen or what, but I'm thankful for the opportunity to get to teach this. Because what do most people think about Paul and the life that he led? I could never live up to that, right? Well, when you realize that he was the persecutor, became the persecuted, and still remained faithful even when it was persecution, those things he was doing were being done to him, gives us a little bit more hope. See the human side of it, as it were. Next one. What else? Paul. What do you... Huh? Servant. Sure. Servant. How do we know? How do we know Paul? Huh? I started to say, it's kind of one of those deals. Remember when I told you if you read through those introductions, you'll see him refer to himself as an apostle? He also referred to himself as a servant in multiple places. There's another thing. It's interesting you bring that up. And here's another interesting study. And this is an easier one than it sounds like. Okay? Everybody here knows what a concordance is. They're very simple. They use Strong's or some of the others. They're very, very easy. Sometime, go through, and there again, through Paul's writings, you'll hear him talk about a couple things. And one of the things is a fellow servant. In some of those introductions and the closings of his letters, he'll talk about fellow servant, fellow laborer. Same kind of idea, isn't it, as servant? And you'll see yoke fellow. Notice how they've all got that word fellow in them? That's how a concordance works. It's pretty easy to find that stuff. So it's one of those deals that, yes, he definitely was a servant. He called himself a servant, and he called out, commended brethren who were fellow servants, laborers, workers with him in many things, and all of those letters that we were talking about. Yeah, very good, servant. What else? Teacher. Teacher. Huh? Yeah, teacher. You know, isn't it interesting, and this happens oftentimes, you can almost tell sometimes when somebody is in the education business, and maybe they get up and teach a Bible class or whatever, and it's kind of like you can be trained to teach better, right? We've already talked about, he sat at the feet of the best of teachers. And oh, by the way, when it was time for his calling, because the Bible uses that phrase, to be a teacher of the things of God, the true things of God, the very first teacher he heard then was Jesus Christ. We've already talked about that. So he had heard as good as there was. And he definitely had many opportunities to teach. As a matter of fact, if you go and you look, your Bibles may have this. We talk about, and if your Bible don't have this, y'all all remember this. It's I had a flashback there for just a minute. Y'all remember those Bibles that were about this big? I can't carry those anymore because if you notice, I got to have these to read this one. But you remember in the back they had those maps, and they had the red lines and the blue lines and all of that type of stuff. And it was always Paul's first missionary journey, Paul's second missionary journey. And that's the way it went. And we see a lot of that stuff recorded over there in the latter part of the book of Acts. And oftentimes, and it wouldn't take hardly anything to flip over there, and you would see that it talks about even in verse 16, says, then came he to Derbe and Lystra. Then it talks about when they passed through Amphipolis in 17 and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica there at the very first verse. But notice verse 2 of Acts chapter 17. It says there, and Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. So now, wait a minute. If we want to have and do and be some of the things that Paul is and his growth, I would need to be prepared to. Now notice, it doesn't say that the opportunity might arise or what, but would I need to be prepared to be able to go in and reason for 3 days from the Scriptures? Yeah. Matter of fact, the Bible assures us very clearly. What does it say? Be ready always to give an answer of the hope that lies within. Preach the word, huh? Study to show thyself approved, yes. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season. We know those verses, right? But in our life, do we let those things be part of the construction, as it were, part of the building of a servant? Well, we know what happened with Paul. And since he's our topic for tonight, we need to make sure that we try to wear that as well, be that as well. So yeah, definitely was a teacher. Yeah. What else? Tent maker. One I didn't think of, but let's think about that a minute. Reason that just a moment. Why does it matter that he's a tent maker? Why does it matter that we know that? Exactly the same answer. Exactly the same answer. He had the ability to labor and support himself. And oftentimes he said, I don't want to be at the chart. I don't want to be at anybody's debt, so to speak. He could go in and he could do these things. There are people, I'll make this statement, I know very few from this congregation. Okay? But I can make this statement with full assurity because I know how people are, I know how Christians are. There are people that are not here tonight because they had a hard day at work. I can say that with full assurity. Because here's what I know. You go over here in the hills, a little over an hour away, Cave City, Arkansas, there are people in that building that are not, that attend there that are not there tonight because they had a hard day at work. So I guess the thing we learn from that is what? That we can be a tent maker, a physical laborer, and still be a servant. We can still be all of those things. A teacher, we've talked about. Yeah. I didn't think about that one, but I like it. Tent maker. What else? Oh, yeah, that's a... Does it matter where you're from? Does it matter where you're from? Yeah. Sure it does. Sure. You know, it's weird. Terry Jo can attest to this. Isn't it neat how when you go somewhere else, you get to be the expert? I mean, isn't that weird how that works? But, you know, I'm just a guy who went to school at Cave City, graduated there and stuff. Yeah, I'm preaching and all that. But, you know, it's funny. You get called in and you do these things, and all of a sudden you become an expert. So it does matter where you're from, both positively and negatively, right? You know, like I said, if you're from far off, you're an expert. But oftentimes, if you're from close, no matter what you say is going to change somebody's mind, right? That's an interesting dynamic that most preachers don't ever get to deal with. All those people in that community where I preach, watch me go up and come through high school and play ball and graduate. So it matters where you're from, doesn't it? I didn't ever think about that with him calling out a Roman. Matter of fact, it mattered very much so with Paul, didn't it? Him being a Roman citizen, and that situation helped him out a bunch, right? Yeah, pretty interesting. What'd you have? I heard you talking back here. What was it? Well, no, don't be talking like that. A drip under pressure. I like it. All right. Well, that'll work. Now that's a good point. It doesn't matter to God, but oftentimes it matters to man. As a matter of fact, think about this. There was a man that this was said about. Nothing good ever came from Nazareth, right? Who was that about? Jesus. Nothing good ever came from Nazareth. You remember that story, what happened? Nathanael just said, come see. Just look, I understand what you're thinking. Just come see. Right? Come see. But yes, it doesn't matter to Jesus, or to God, to Jesus and all that, because we know there's neither bond nor free, Jew nor Greek, all of that type of stuff. We understand that. But guess what? In our walk, spiritual walk in this life, we've got to do it physically as well. And so sometimes it matters to those that are around us. Good one. What else? Thorn in the flesh. I've got on some new shoes tonight. Y'all don't stare at them too much. I'm going somewhere with this. Some of these internet marketers do really good. These popped up and it said, dress shoes that are as comfortable as sneakers. Well, from where you sit, you can understand that I'm overweight. You can't see that I've got a bad right knee. And, oh, by the way, my left one flares up every now and then. So guess what? A very important topic to me is shoes that are comfortable. Yeah, I got one back here going, feet. Yeah, you want comfortable shoes, right? And, oh, by the way, if they're dress shoes, that's even better. Okay? Why? You know, let's just say I had a big funeral a week ago today. You go, and how long are you on your feet when you go to those things? You know, you get there before everybody else does, open the building, let everybody in, and make sure the family's taken care of. Before long, you've been there 6 hours standing on your feet. When your right knee flares up, it's my right knee. When your right knee flares up, you're not as personable, right? You have to work through that. It hinders your performance as a servant, as a teacher, as a whatever. So we talked about that long list over there in 2 Corinthians. Where would you have slipped off the sandals, so to speak, and all of those persecutions and all of the difficulties? Where would you have bailed out? We don't think about the one that was there every day, oftentimes. That thorn in the flesh, remember? That's harder because those things are just kind of there every day. You don't get a break from it. Good one. What else? I've got one. That's probably going to be a good one to kind of start wrapping up on. What about the opinionated Paul? You ever think of Paul as being opinionated? Okay. Turn to 1 Corinthians. You know this passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. When you get there to verse 6, it says, "But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I." Was that an opinion? We better do our heads this way, right? Because he said, I'm writing this because I've been given permission to. Right? Because what's God's teaching on marriage? It goes all the way back, remember? For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, cleave unto his wife, they two shall be one flesh. But we know that there were some difficulties and things surrounding at this time. So Paul, by permission, wrote, it's better. Think about that, if you will. Would it be easier? I'm going to use myself as an example. Would it be easier for me to go about and do the things, be a teacher, be a servant, and all of those types of things, if it was just me? Now, I'm fortunate tonight I've got my bunch back here on the back pew. Okay? But would there be some things be easier if it was just me I had to worry about? I wouldn't have to make as many tents, would I? Does that make, right? I wouldn't have to think about all of those types of things. Now, like in my situation, without my wife, I would not be a Christian, so I wouldn't have been doing the right work anyway, you see. So it's kind of one of those deals that, but that's stuff that we can reason and rationalize in our mind. But how does that play a part in our lives today? What does opinion matter? Or does opinion matter? In our idea of being a servant that's under construction, how does opinion play into that? Can we have them? Sure. Sure. I want to ask a question. It's going to be a tough one. I've never worshiped here. Let's say I roll in here on a Sunday morning, here for the time and dismiss and leave. How much of what I will see on that Lord's Day is opinion? Be very careful with that answer. I've not worshiped here. So if I was asking for a percentage, what do you think? Percentage-wise, what would be the answer? How much would be opinion? Probably more than you'd think. We've been given instructions for the Lord's Day, right? How to sing. We're taking of the Lord's Supper. We know we're supposed to give, and we're supposed to preach, and we're supposed to pray, and all of those types of things. But then think about this. How much of it are we not told? What time do y'all get here on Sunday mornings? Huh? I don't know. What time service start? 9 o'clock. Well, at Cave City, we start at 9:15. Somebody got to be doing something wrong. That's what opinion, if you're not careful, will get you, right? So one of the best things that we can understand and learn is that we can have an opinion. Notice, Paul here had an opinion, and even with by permission, he didn't say this is the only way you can do it. He goes on and gives a lot of instruction, doesn't he? My recommendation, this is the best way. Just like, I'm pretty sure it's scriptural. You have 3 songs and a prayer before the preacher. Y'all do that here? How many you sing? Look at that. See, at Cave City, we don't do it scripturally. We do 2 songs, a prayer, and then a song. So, I know that sounds so silly. I understand to us that sounds silly. But do you realize how many congregations of the Lord's people are suffering because they didn't realize that you can have an opinion and it not be doctrine? Paul understood that here, didn't he? Catch that? In his teaching, it was like, here it is. Now, granted, the beautiful thing is, you are blessed with an eldership. And whenever they make a decision, and they understand that these decisions, many of them are not binding. If an extra song is led or a song is left off, or though, they understand that it doesn't condemn us all. Now, granted, if they roll an organ and a piano and stuff in here, then there's going to be a problem, right? Because those things go against what we're taught. So we have to realize that we can, and Paul did, not just here, even back before, and we talked about that a little bit, how he had an opinion before that was wrong. Matter of fact, he said in all good conscience he was doing what he was doing, right? But notice the difference. The opinion Paul had when he was Saul, what was he doing? He was binding it on everybody he come in contact with. If you're one of these, it's bound on you. What did he do here? He still had an opinion, but he said, it's better. You don't have to do it this way, but this is better for the present distress and all those things that we talk about. We meet at Cave City at 9:15, have a Bible class, have our worship hour, 10 o'clock. 11 o'clock, we take about a 15-minute break. We come back and have our second Bible class. We don't come back on Sunday evening. Whew. That was hard to get used to. That was hard to get used to. Matter of fact, I'm still not real used to it, and it's been almost 4 years. That's the way that my elders chose to set up service time. And there's no biblical conflict. So guess what I do? Yeah. Mike and I, as a matter of fact, were visiting my house just the other day, and he made mention as they were traveling. We were just sitting there talking. He said, I wish they would do this at a certain congregation he'd been visiting with. And I agreed. In my opinion, that would have been the best thing too. And guess what? We can't go tell them how to do that, can we? We can't do that. But here's what happens. Somebody gets a hold of something, and you can think about all the examples, one cup and all of those other types of things that has been dealt with by the Lord's church for all these years. They come across something. You can scripturally partake of the Lord's Supper with one cup. You can do that. But you can't tell me that I've got to. Right? Isn't that amazing how that works? That's exactly what Paul was doing here. And we don't often think about that Paul was opinionated. As a matter of fact, one of the things that he had an opinion on, here's one. Let's go to the book of Romans as we wrap this up. Romans chapter 10. The very first verse, you know this verse. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel, that they might be saved. Did he know the outcome of that? He did. He did. But notice, because of some of the other characteristics, we could talk about the compassionate Paul, couldn't we? We could talk about the confident Paul. You know, to even make that statement, for him to make that statement, because primarily, for that group of people to be saved, who was going to have to preach to them? Not him, right? Because we understand who Paul's primary audience was to be. But his heart's desire was what? That Israel be saved. That was his opinion. He wanted. We know and we understand. We can go back and we can look at Jesus Christ's ministry, and he was clearly told them that they all wouldn't be. As a matter of fact, even carrying through to now, how many be there that find it? Few. How many's a few? You know, that's at least we know that, right? Yeah. We know that at one time a few was 8. I wonder what a few is now. We don't have to debate that, right? Because guess what? It would just be opinion, wouldn't it? There's some say what? 144,000, don't they? They like to go over the book of Revelation. Oh, there's a good number for you. Right? They like that number. But I can tell you this, when it says few, when it says remnant, when it says those types of things, it's not the majority, right? It's not even a strong percentage. But he was still allowed to have that opinion caused by his compassion, caused by his background, where he was from, what he was born into, the teaching that he had, all of those things that we've mentioned played into that. Let me ask you this as we begin to wrap this up. Does all of your background and upbringing and all the things, does it affect your Christian walk of life? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Some of those things we have to put aside, put behind, put away, all of those types of things. I was not raised in the Lord's church. Okay? So it kind of, I had to learn some things, well, more perfectly. I think that's the best way to put it. The Bible puts it that way, right? There were those that were taught more perfectly. I had to learn more perfectly because I had some background. Here's what's unfortunate. I told you how good we had it earlier, and we do. We've got brothers and sisters in Christ that want to bring their small children to hear about the things of God, and these servants that are under construction. We read about it in the Bible, understanding that that applies to us as well. But the things of the Bible and the things of the church are not specific to the northeast part of Arkansas or the whole of Arkansas or the United States. These things can be taught anywhere man will listen. It doesn't matter where you're from. We need to be under construction, willing to listen, to mold, to build, all of those types of things. And some of these things we're going to have to get over. Some of them we're not. What's the chances of you being persecuted for what you believe? Depends on how you define persecution, right? I don't think it's going to be them 40 stripes save one, generally speaking. I'm 50 and I've not been in prison yet for preaching, and I've been doing it 20-ish years or so. Yeah, so it might happen someday. You do realize that there are parts of the world, Christians, that very well could happen tomorrow or might have happened today. The Lord's church is bigger than Cave City, than Greensboro Road, than this part of Arkansas, the whole of the Bible Belt. So we need to make sure and teach it that way, because we can all learn and we can be better. Anything before we close? Got to be some thoughts. So, here's your homework. Read through Paul's letters. Remember that, just first few verses. It don't take long, about 20 minutes. You have it done. Do that. And then, out of all the things that we talked about tonight, the attributes, characteristics of Paul, figure out which one that you can take on that needs the most work. It might be servant. It very well could be tent maker. You know, imagine if you was talking to someone who was just as lazy as they could be and didn't want to work and those types of things. Would that be something you'd need to get over as a Christian? Yes, of course it would. So, pick one of these, or maybe one you come up with on your own. Figure out how you can be a servant under construction, working on being better than you were. Pretty good way to leave it. We'll just end it there. Thank you.